Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon at home and good afternoon, everyone here in the Blauwe Zaal. Welcome to this program by Studium Generale. And I'm not that surprised to find out that so many of you are interested in finding out what happens in our brains when we have sex. Because both brains and sex are two very popular topics here at this university. Only 2 weeks ago, we had another lecture about the brain. It was about the gut-brain axis, about the interactions between your brain and your digestive system. Well, today we're going to be looking at a different interaction between your brain and your sexual behavior, and your sex. What's our real motive for having sex? You might think reproduction. You might be wrong. Are we guided by our brains or by our genitals? How unique is human sex? And how does one study questions like this? Well, we're very fortunate to have one of the few Dutch experts here with us today who actually studies this, Janniko Georgiadis. He is head of the section Anatomy and Medical Physiology at the University Medical Center in Groningen. And he studies the link between sexual behavior and sex as a product of our brain. The overarching theme of his research is to gain a better understanding of positive feelings in social situations. Here to tell us all about the interactions between brain and sex, please welcome Janniko Georgiadis.
Thank you so much for this very kind introduction. I traveled a long way to get here. I come from Groningen. That's a long way. It's an important city, especially this week, because we play Ajax on Saturday. I must say it's really a big reward to see so many of you here in this room after such a long time of seeing people only, you know, like Muppets in a Muppet Show kind of situation. So this is very good. So thank you all for coming out to this lecture. So indeed, I work in Groningen in the University Hospital, UMCG. I'm a neuroscientist by training. I'm also an anatomist and an educationalist. And I'm here to talk about one of my big hobbies, which is sex. And I guess I'm not the only one in the room to whom this applies. And what I intend to do is to give you some concept of how sex might work in our brains, how we accomplish this. We have to realize, or I have to explain, so this is sort of a disclaimer that this is a very, very wide topic. You could talk about many things, but I usually focus on what I consider to be the hardcore of sex, which is the sexual activity itself. All right. So the sexual brain it is. So can we have sex without brains? Yes, of course we can. This is a sponge having sex. And so it's not very exciting, but what we can see here is the sponge is it's emitting this sort of smoke in the water, but it's actually the ejaculate of the sponge, and this ejaculate is going to travel. The current is just going to take it to other sponges, and that's the way this sponge can reproduce, let's say, sexually. Which is, of course, good because it increases genetic variation. It can also decide to just divide itself up into pieces and then clone itself. It just depends on the circumstances. A sponge it's a very funny animal because it's an animal without neurons. It does not have a single neuron. Still, it's an animal. That's also why it's so extremely funny that SpongeBob is a sponge. So this is a form of sexual activity that does not require neurons. There's also sexual activity that does require neurons, actually billions of neurons. And so we can see that what neurons do to us, what our brains do to us, what our central nervous system and our peripheral nervous systems offer us is just an incredible amount of contexts that can be added as layers on our behavior. Our behavior becomes very layered. And so we can have the situation where we really care a lot and care very deeply about sex, which is, I think very sort of intricate part of the human condition, where we can have the situation where we misinterpret, signals emitted by other people. This is never going to happen to the sponge, of course. There's no way that this can be misinterpreted. It's just the ejaculate will just travel and just land on another sponge that happens to be female. So, so I think it's important to think about how brains do this, and how this behavior can occur as a consequence of our brain function. So, first of all, contexts in terms of the brain. And this is a very old model of how you can see brain function. It's also a model that has been heavily criticized. But in general, I think it's a useful, I mean, all models are bad, right? I mean, I don't have to tell you, you're technical guys. But this model, I think, is useful. So you may consider the neural axis, which is basically just the axis of the central nervous system, consisting of three basic layers. There's a first layer that runs up until, I'm just going to indicate it to you because I have no, okay. I'm not sure if the people at home can see, but the first layer is going to run up to this level here, which is the hypothalamus, just included in that level, and also the spinal cord. You have to believe me, it's running down here. Of course, it's much longer than it's depicted here, and the brainstem, which is here. This is the level of the neural axis that is responsible for regulating our bodily function at a sort of automatic level. It can also, sort of the top level of that is the hypothalamus, which can take care of our bodily functions in a slightly higher context. It can release hormones that can instead lead to the release of other hormones, which regulate our body. So some of these processes are very fast, some are slower, like hormonal changes are usually slower, but nevertheless, here it's all about autonomic regulation of bodily function and about homeostasis. We share this with many other animals, including, and at least with many other vertebrates, including the ones that we don't, let's say, wouldn't put a lot of trust in. We wouldn't allow these animals to take care of our mortgages, you know, like lizards. This is basically very, very similar between those animals and us. The second layer, sort of superimposed on that, is a layer that is taking place more or less around the this structure here, which is the corpus callosum. There's a big ventricle behind it, and the brain tissue that is around it is responsible for our emotions, by and large. So what that means is that this layer can actually achieve control over the first layer. Actually, it's all about achieving control over that first layer and making it more complex, adding contexts. Just taking into account larger context, more stimuli in the environment and also from within the body. And this is more of an allostatic level. That means that not only are you able to control your homeostasis, but you can also regulate behavior in sort of complex ways to make sure that homeostasis is more likely to be maintained, right? So you can just behave in certain ways, influencing other people, influencing your own body, and so on and so forth. So this is what you could also call emotion. It usually carries also emotional expressions. And then the third layer, the highest level, if you will, the pinnacle of human brain function, you could call it cognition, but it's basically just the cerebral cortex, not all parts of it, but many parts of it, that regulate more complex functions that are also a little bit more abstract. Now, the criticism that this model has received is that it's not only top-down, it's also bottom-up, so all of these layers influence each other. There is no cognition without emotion, there's no emotion without cognition, for instance, okay? Many decisions we make on the basis of emotions, or at least with emotions playing a role. So that has been one of the criticisms, but if we just assume that everything interacts, I think this is useful. And we will see, if we go through some of the experiments that have been performed, we will actually see all of these layers of the neural axis take part in sexual activity. It's not like sex is just a very basic function that we have and it's buried somewhere, you know, deep down in our neural axis. All of these layers are going to be important for it. All right, so just some examples. So I realize that perhaps not all of you are familiar with how brain imaging results are depicted. So I am going to sort of walk you through it. Here we see a section of the, so this is a section made like this, okay? And the other one is a section made like this, so it's sort of perpendicular to the left section. What we see is two areas highlighted. Actually, these areas were the focus of this research, and that's not for nothing, because this is the prefrontal cortex, and especially the top part of it, which is considered to be the, let's say, the part that's really uniquely human. No other animal has it in the way we have it. So this is really the part that's very important for our human function, our reasoning, and things like that. So you could say it's the most abstract part of our brain in a way, or abstract functioning part of our brain. And then this area here is the amygdala, which is basically one of the main areas of this level 2, emotional part of the brain. And we can here see this is an experiment in sexually impulsive men, and also in men who do not indicate sexual impulsiveness. So these are men who have very great difficulties controlling their sexual urges, or at least that's what they report. And if we study these men, we see that the interaction between this dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the amygdala is weaker in these men than it is in men who do not report this loss of control, indicating that perhaps for them this lower level is just more impulsive, more sort of taking over. It's more responsive to sexual stimuli, and they find it difficult to control. It could, of course, also be a consequence of the fact that they are suffering from this problem. This is something that neuroimaging, so brain imaging, cannot resolve. So in this case, you have to imagine people are in a scanner situation and they watch images, for example, and they need to respond to these images. And then you can do analysis and find this particular relationship has changed in a subset of people. This is a study we did in Groningen, and I was also involved in that study, where so just a demonstration of a different interaction. And here we had men inside a scanner, and the men didn't come along to the scanner. They brought their partner, their real-life partner, sexual partner, and they were stimulated sexually, genitally, while they were laying inside the scanner. So you have to just sort of maybe just digest this a bit, okay? So just imagine an MR scanner, and maybe some of you have once, had an examination in an MR scanner. The bore is up till here, right? It's up until your the middle of your body. So genitals are barely sticking out, and then you have to imagine that there's the partner standing next and just providing genital stimulation manually. And at the same time, the person inside the scanner needs to be extremely, or at least as still as possible, because we don't want too much head movement. Nevertheless, so we wanted to keep things very simple for the participants inside the scanner. So they were told there's going to be two periods of sexual stimulation to your genitals. The first time you cannot have an orgasm, the second time you can. So this is good for men, it's simple. And so this is just the penile signal. So we measured the penile circumference during this experiment. So this is the first time, and then they indicated, just by raising their hand, that orgasm was imminent, and then we stopped. And the second time they could ejaculate, as you can see here. And so these were just two waves of sexual arousal, and then you can just go into the brain imaging data, because you're imaging the brains at the same time, and we could actually see, and so the orange areas indicate areas that correlate positively with these waves, and the blue areas indicate are blood flow changes that correlate negatively. So basically, two opposing forces inside the brain during sexual arousal. And interestingly, this is cingulate cortex, which is, let's say, part of the emotional brain. This is the hypothalamus, which is, we sort of zoomed in on it, you just have to believe me, which is part of the sort of layer 1, very basic part of the brain. And there's interactions between them, right? We see that the cingulate cortex is interacting with certain parts of the hypothalamus during arousal, positively, and another part of the cingulate cortex interacting with other parts of the hypothalamus when arousal is over and you need to depress it. So two sort of opposing forces inside the brain, interacting levels during sexual arousal. I mean, I'm not sure, I mean, we don't know exactly what this means, but it's interesting to see, and also because these are actually very generic. I mean, if you put people in the scanner, you let them do other things, actually they will also activate these areas quite easily. So it's not only that you see here an expression of sexual activity, you see an expression of arousal or of de-arousal. And this is hinting at the fact that sex is actually going to hijack many very generic areas of the brain. Okay, so sex is not only in one nucleus deep inside the brain, a dirty nucleus. No, it's in many parts of the brain. And it's actually not only in your brain, it's of course in your body as well. We know genitalia, it's not a surprise, they will react to sexual stimulation. They're actually very important for sexual activity. But you are probably aware of the fact that when you're aroused, your heart rate goes up, your respiration goes up, you start to transpire. I mean, there's many things that happen to your body when you are aroused. One of the experiments that we have done recently is whether we could actually measure sexual arousal in the breath of people. So for this experiment, we placed people in front of a screen and they watched erotic movies. And at the same time, we actually measured the exhaled breath, you know, and saw whether there would be sort of compounds in the breath that would be sort of specific to sexual arousal. And so that's sort of interesting. We found actually many components that increased or decreased, but not specifically during sexual arousal. We also had some other non-sexually arousing, but emotional stimuli. But there were some signals like isoprene, which is stored inside your muscle, for example, that seems to have a more specific relation to sex. We see it being depressed more during sexual activity than the sexual movies than, for instance, sports movies and fearful movies. So this is a sort of interesting idea that perhaps sexual arousal is also embodied in a way, that our body, of course, has a sort of a certain physiological response that has generic components, but also perhaps specific components. And we hope that this will hopefully help us to identify sexual arousal better, because now we usually have to measure, for instance, erectile responses, vaginal responses, which are very intrusive. So we have the situation that, and I think this is very important, that we should not look at sexual activity as just occurring in one organ. It's occurring in a wider context, it's occurring in multiple parts of the brain, but the brain is also connected to the body, specifically the genitalia, but also other parts of the body. And the body is also doing things that will influence, in turn, the brain. For instance, genitalia produce sex steroids, and these sex steroids are taken up by the blood and actually are going to, and the brain is actually going to respond to that in the sense that the sensitivity to sexual stimuli will be modulated. So it's a really ingenious system. At the same time, our brains take care of much more complex contexts. We have feelings that we take into account. We have our desires and our wishes, and we are not alone. We also have a social context. We may have a partner. We may have a concept of what is allowed sexually or what is morally just or valid or allowed and what not. So we also live in a social context. And all of this, I believe, interacts in the brain. And I think that's also why this is such an interesting organ to study for that reason. So, talking about sex, of course, that's also how I began. You can think about it in many different ways. But if we just think about sexual activity, where does it begin? Freud was one of the people thinking about this, also wrote a lot about it. He's also the one that really made famous the concept of libido, or libido. And libido to him was like a force from within that just basically came out of nowhere, but it had to be released. And if you could not release your libido, then you were bound to have problems because that was considered to be very unhealthy. In his concept, sexual desire comes out of the blue. It comes out of nothing. It's in a sort of an... it cannot be explained where it starts, basically. We have now abandoned this, and there are more sort of modern theories that are also usually sort of inspired by neuroscientific theories that are more dynamic, I would say. Okay, so there's a very dominant theory about how there are sexual incentives from within your body, but usually around you, and how your brain should be sensitive to that. So you need both. You need the stimulation, but you also need the sensitivity to that stimulation. I think a very important example of how the sensitivity may not be present is, of course, in children before puberty. Children before puberty typically are not very sensitive in a sexual way to sexual stimuli. They may find it funny, they may find it interesting, but it does not excite them usually. And this is because their brains are not yet sensitive to it. Okay? And of course you can also have a situation where there are very few sexual incentives, even though in our modern day society this is very difficult. Even more dynamic are theories where we do not, because this is still very, let's say, unidimensional in the sense that it's just considering one person, but of course we are not alone. We are also interacting with other people, and we have to take into account that our behavior is always sort of mutually influencing other people's behavior. And when we go into social situations, we always take our prior knowledge into these situations. We are Bayesian, okay? And so the fact that you bring in your prior knowledge, your assumptions into a situation, also into sexual situations, I think is now also becoming more and more clear, even though there's actually no research into this. And I think the fact that this is the way we interact, we are starting to understand it now better and better, is also something that is going to be interesting in the future. Okay, so let's have a look at this sexual incentive sensitivity. This is a study coming out of Leiden, just already quite a long time ago. And what happened here is that people were inside the scanner, and they were watching erotic images, but these images were presented very, very briefly. So you see here an image behind this fire extinguisher thing, whatever it is. And it was presented only 26 milliseconds. This means that if you show something for a much longer duration, immediately afterwards you cannot see it consciously, but you process it in your brain. So this is called the subliminal design. You may have heard about it. So in the brain you can actually trace back the networks that will respond to this stimulus, and which are these ones. So we see here a layer 2 area. This is the cingulate cortex we saw before, but also deeper in the brain, areas of the cerebral nuclei, like the ventral part of the striatum, which is a very important target of dopamine inside the brain. So this, you can consider this to be a sort of a network. These areas sort of correlate with each other. You very often see them co-activating. Now, interestingly, you can modulate the activity of this. So to me, this is an indication of the sensitivity of the brain to sexual stimulation, and you can modulate that. So if you give people a drug that will increase or decrease their dopamine transmission, actually this will be affected. Okay, so you can give haloperidol, which is an antipsychotic. It lowers the dopamine transmission in the brain, and as a result, these areas will respond less to the sexual stimulation. And alternatively, or conversely, you can also give levodopa, which is also given to Parkinson's patients. It increases dopamine transmission, and it will actually increase the activity in these areas when the incentive is given. So this is very important. It only has its function then, right? So that's the interaction between the incentive and the sensitivity to the incentive. So we can see that this is situational, because also in us, our dopamine levels are not going to be stable over the day. And also there are many other factors that can influence this sensitivity, for instance, stress, or our sex steroid levels, and so on and so forth. It's also individual. Not everyone is the same. And that doesn't only concern dopamine, it actually concerns also many other factors. Okay, prior knowledge. We talked about it before, but it's also very important. This is a very fun study. And it was done by former colleagues of mine from Groningen, but I think they performed it in Amsterdam. Cool study. They invited men to their lab, to their imaging lab, and these men received the instruction that they would be caressed on their inner thigh. Okay, and the caress, I mean, it was a caress. So it was very gentle, sort of sensual touch, which can be, of course, exciting. And they were told that they were introduced to two Confederates, one and both wearing a black top, as you can see. One was male and one was female. And these men were heterosexual men, so men with a very strong heterosexual preference. So they were told that they would see an image of these Confederates before the stimulation began, indicating who was stimulating. And then they were asked, you know, how did you find the stimulation? Normally, these caresses are perceived as quite pleasurable. But interestingly, you know, when they were asked, you know, to rate the stimulations, when they thought it was a female Confederate stimulating them, they were highly positive. When they thought it was the male Confederate stimulating them, they were quite negative. The interesting thing was that it was always the same person stimulating, but they couldn't see. So they brought in their prior knowledge into the experiment. It greatly influenced the way they perceived it, and it also greatly influenced the brain activity. Here we see the somatosensory cortex of these people activating during the caress, where we can already see that it's stronger during the female situation than during the male situation. And this is already present when they received the cue and they could actually think about what was going to happen next. Okay? So your priors are extremely important. You bring them into the sexual situation. And I think more of this kind of research is necessary. Just looking at Marla, 5 more minutes. Okay. So I need to think about how we can wrap this up. Okay. So I think what is very important is that it's not only about reproduction. It's not only about that function of sex. It's also sex is also something that we experience, and it's probably much more important than we think. The problem is we cannot study it very well in humans. There are indications from the animal research that especially first sexual experiences are extremely important in laying out the pathway towards sexual preferences. So these are preferences for specific sort of characteristics of conspecifics. It's not the same as an orientation, right? Because that is whether you're interested in male or female conspecifics, but just characteristics of that person are probably something that are learned through associations with sexual reward. Now, the problem, of course, in humans is that the first sexual experience usually happen at a non-consenting age. So it's very difficult to study human beings under these conditions. So we rely very much on animal research for that. There are some weird experiments out there where really interesting sexual preferences can be learned through sexual reward. Okay, so in this particular experiment, a rat was tethered against the wall of his cage. So this is like a Teflon jacket, and you have to imagine there is like a cord here, tethering it to the wall of the cage. And this is, whenever this rat was allowed to have sex, it always used to have the jacket on. Then they tested the rat without the jacket, so with the jacket off. Without the jacket, of course they did it in groups of rats. Without the jacket, the rat was completely confused. Okay, it took much longer to intromit, which means intromission is putting the penis into the vagina, but also far less motivated. So these rats run around their cages, and so these level changes indicate how motivated they are. So this makes a huge difference. Even though this jacket doesn't mean anything in the evolutionary history of the rat, it has become part of the sexual repertoire. It has become basically predictive of sexual reward. If you take it away, just everything is messed up. So there is at least a contextual cue for sexual activity. I'm not sure if you should call it a preference, actually, but nevertheless. So sex is the result of procreative systems in our brain, which must be there. For instance, the systems that make us release our sex steroid hormones. I mean, these systems, of course, are instrumental, but they must interact with other brain systems. Most prominently perhaps the reward system. So there is always some balance between procreation and other reasons to have sex, and this balance shifts towards other reasons when you climb up the evolutionary ladder. Of course, this is not a valid ladder, I realize that, but we see how sexual behavior becomes more and more and more complex and also more sort of liberated from procreation as you approach the human situation. Okay, so that I think is a very important message. All right, so we should see sex, I think, to really understand it as a pleasure-motivated behavior. Just like any other behavior, it consists of different phases where we identify the stimuli that are pleasurable to us, that we want. We consume them, and then we may like them or dislike them. We learn from that. We may update our expectations, for example. And at a certain point, we also need to become satiated and inhibit. This is not a scheme specific to sex. It's a scheme that applies to every motivated behavior, from eating to taking drugs to other behaviors as well. And you can also apply it to sex. And perhaps as a final slide, if you will allow me, Marle, if you go into the brain and look at these different phases, and this is a meta-analysis that we did some time ago, you can also see that for the brain, these phases are very different. So the wanting phase, which is the initial phase, where you expect the stimulation to happen, where you have the first signs of desire, involves certain areas of the brain, here depicted in red. And when you start to become aroused and you achieve orgasm, this shifts. And actually you get some activity, or actually decreased, the blue indicates decreased activity in many parts of the brain. So you get a shift in network activity. It's almost like you drive your car, you shift gears, and that also seems to be the case with sexual activity. You have to go to different phase. You actually also have to shift to different network activities in your brain. And the way we accomplish that is unknown. We have no idea how we do that. What we do know is that many people achieve problems with these phase transitions, whether it's the ability to become aroused or the ability to achieve orgasm. These probably also all involve the fact that you need to switch from one stage to the other. And so this is, I think, an important goal for future research. Now, in conclusion, so central nervous system is on this biopsychosocial interaction, so it's important to use it, I think, as a model to study sex. Reproduction is not why humans have sex. We have sex for many other reasons, and reproduction is sort of a side effect, which is useful, but nevertheless it's a side effect. Most of our sexual interactions by far never ever lead to reproduction, okay? But look at us here, we're very successful. There's not one sex nucleus in the brain, but rather there are many generic brain systems that participate. And I think the key is really in understanding the configuration of brain networks that take part. There I think we're going to find more sexual specificity. And sex is not a passive behavior, it's an active behavior, it's a proactive behavior even. And that's also something that we need to understand. And I think we can understand it also by not inviting just single subjects, but really subjects together with their partners or the people they're interested in. Thank you so much for attending. I think I went over time a little bit, just a little bit, but I already warned you that this could be the case. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Janniko. I can imagine it's quite a bit of cherry picking among all this interesting research about our brain during sex. We have a few minutes left for questions, and there are already quite a few questions online. And I'm going to start with one that was also a question I had myself. Is that the research you showed was mainly research that you carried out on men?
Yeah.
Is there a certain reason for that?
Yeah, I think that's a very good remark. So it's certainly not true that women are less interesting or less important. One of the challenges is that if you do, especially if you do research that also involves measurements on the genitalia, it's just much more easier on men. But that also creates a bias because
Yeah.
because then you think next time you think, oh yeah, I've done that before, so it's easier. So I concede that this is a problem in sex research. We tend to focus on men a lot because they are just kind of easier to study. But we do see that things are changing.
I could say that's generic for much research on men
Yeah,
and
no,
women.
no. So I agree. It's just not good, you know. So that needs to change. And I think, fortunately, there is now a lot of interest also in the female direction. So, but I realized that I didn't show much of that. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
So fair remark. Yeah.
Questions in the room? We have a catch box.
I hope no one gets hurt.
Not yet? We have
There's a question here.
Go ahead.
My question is, to what degree is sexual impulsiveness genetic versus those environmental, psychosocial factors that you mentioned?
I think, like other forms of impulsivity, my guess would be that there's a genetic component. But of course, genes do not determine anything, right? It's always the interaction with the environment. So it's also always very important to think about, you know, the context in which the behavior takes place and the individual is exposed to. But I do believe that there is a genetic component, but we don't know.
And do you believe that it's related to impulsiveness in general?
I believe so, yeah.
So you wouldn't have someone who's, for instance, very impulsive with everything but sex, or the other way around?
I would say that would be a generic trait. But of course, I mean, you can only be interested in so many things, right? So in some people it will express in a sexual way, in other people it may express in a different way, like gambling. There's a big problem, let's say conceptually, to understand this impulsive, because now I called it impulsiveness. Other people would call it addiction, right? Other people might call it compulsion, which of course is a different thing. But we still are struggling with finding the right labels for this. So sex addiction, of course, is also I mean, it's a label that carries a lot of load, but also means that you could start treating in a certain way. My problem with that is that we don't really know whether this is an addiction or not. So that's why I called it impulsive, because it actually fits the characteristic best. These are usually men who indicate that they cannot control themselves very well. They don't indicate necessarily an addictive-like phenotype. So I think it's different, but I mean, this is my opinion.
So they're not correlated to addicts per se.
I mean, of course, in any form of addiction, you will also find a level of impulsiveness, right? So it's always difficult to separate. But some elements of an addiction are not present in these people. So that is why I tend to disagree with that label. But
can you maybe say, because there are quite a lot of questions in the chat about, for example, certain fetishes, or if you have brain damage, or if you have sexual trauma, how that ties in with your research? Are there any clinical applications at the moment, for example?
Yeah, so at the moment, my own research is most about the connection between the genitalia and the brain, and that would tie most. I mean, for instance, spinal cord injury, or
Okay.
People who have premature ejaculation, and that could also be due to that connection being different. So that is what my research is mostly about normally. When we think about fetishes, for example, then it's. I mean, I am a strong believer in the fact that this has something to do with very early sexual experiences.
Okay.
And many of these fetishes, of course, not problematic, right? They do not do any harm to society. It's just, to me, it's just an indication of how flexible our sexual system must be. So if you compare our sexual system to that of many other animals, it's just so much more flexible. So we can actually choose so many different possible partners. This is not true for many other animals. It's much more restricted. It's much more restricted to a certain time when they are interested in sexual activity, and also to the characteristics of that other conspecific. We can actually learn, or we are open to having sex with many other people. That's also, just look around you and see how different all these people are. I mean, this is a proof of the fact
Yeah.
of the genetic variation that we have. And that can only be achieved if we can be interested in many other people.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's a nice note to end on.
Yeah, I'm very sorry. We could talk about this forever, I suppose, but...
Yeah, because of the time, we have to end this part of the lecture. If you have any questions, please feel free to come forward to Janniko after the lecture. Thanks so much for being here today. Thanks so much for joining us online. Thank you, Janniko. We hope to see you again at Studium Generale.